So today we're going to compare the Nikon 2470 f4 to the Nikon 24-200 in the real world and see how they work for your landscape photography needs. So regular watchers of the YouTube channel know I've been a big fan of the Nikon 24-200 recently. I've been using it a lot since, about November, December of last year, and it's been a frequently used lens in most of my landscape photography over the past several months. It's been very versatile when it comes to travel. It's got a broad focal length, packs down pretty small, pretty light, so it makes it great for travel or when you're trying to keep your pack light. It's also been really good in poor weather where there's maybe snow or a little bit of drizzle, or I don't want to do a lens swap because I don't want to damage the sensor in the camera. So if I can just keep that one lens on and be able to have the variety of focal lengths I want, it's been very handy for that, so it's been working well. However, if you go search around on the internet for some technical reviews of the lens, compared to the 2470 f4, most reviews will say the 24-200 gets a little soft in the corners of the image on a full frame camera. And I've read enough reviews, watched enough YouTube videos that is probably true when you're in a technical environment. But it has me wondering, how does it perform in the real world? Will you notice that softness, or is it one of just those minuscule technical differences that, yes, in a lab environment is a percentage difference, but what about real world images? How does it look? So I've come out here today, we're going to compare the 24-70 f4 compared to the 24-200 zoom lens, and we're going to set the same focal lengths on the same scene from the same tripod, and we're going to same camera settings and see how it performs. We'll take some images while we're out here, we'll take them back to the office and we'll take a look at them in Lightroom, and we'll take a look at those edges, we'll look at the clarity, we'll look at the sharpness, we'll see if there's any instances of flare, though I'm not really shooting into the sun on this particular experiment, so we may not see any flare type instances. It's a little overcast, so may not see that. So predominantly be focusing in on the sharpness of the edges and just see, is the trade-off worth it? Is it compromising my image quality too much, or is it a worthwhile trade-off, and see what happens. So let's move on with this real-world test of the 24-200 compared to the 2470 f4. So the 2470 f4 lens from Nikon is a pretty impressive lens. It is f4 and it maintains a f4 aperture from 24 millimeters all the way out to 70 millimeters, so it's a constant aperture lens. Fairly lightweight, packs down pretty small. And it is an S-series lens, which just means in Nikon terms that it gets a little bit more attention to optical quality and the little extras to give it, a professional quality lens. That's not to say they don't pay the same attention to the other Z-series lens. From what I've seen, all the Z-mount lenses have actually been great lenses. Just the S is just that little cut of the above that's important to you. And they've also kept this lens competitively priced. It can be bought as part of a kit with one of the Nikon mirrorless cameras. So it's a pretty solid 2470 lens and works great for landscape photography. And the 24-200 from Nikon is also a pretty impressive lens. It is a variable aperture lens ranging from f4 to f6.3 depending on the zoom length. It actually loses the f4 pretty early. I want to say, if I remember, right around 50th I start to lose the f4. By the time you're out to 80 millimeters, you're at the f6.3. Now in true low light conditions that could be a problem, but for landscape photographers where we're on a tripod most of the time anyways, I really don't see that as a significant problem. It is not an S-series lens, though from what I've seen just from day-to-day use, like I said, today we're going to do a comparison to the 2470 f4, which is an S-series, but the image quality on this lens has still been pretty impressive to me so far, unless you really dig in and start to pixel peep. The other factor is it is a telescoping zoom, which means when you zoom, the barrel extends. I don't really see that as a problem. Gives me some concerns in really severe poor weather, just because when it goes out, all your precipitation and moisture is going to go on here and then pulled back into the elements. But in a little drizzle, I've used it in snow and I've not had any problems. So, 24-200, it's been pretty impressive so far. But today, like I said, we're going to make that comparison between the 2470 f4 and this 24-200 and just see how the image quality looks and see if those technical reviews that show some softness at the edges, how present that is in the actual real world when you're outdoors and photographing. So let's dive into it. Okay, so the way we're going to run this real world experiment is I'm going to set up this tripod right here. I've got a small woodland scene composed in front of me. It's not particularly noteworthy. This is really more of just an real world experiment between the two lenses. Probably won't get a portfolio worthy image out of this. It's purely, this is more of an experiment this morning. So I'm going to start with the 24-70 f4 and I'm going to shoot at the 24 millimeters, 35 millimeters, 50 millimeters, and 70 millimeters. And then I'm not gonna move anything. I'm gonna switch lenses while the camera's still on the tripod, and with the 24 to 200, I'm gonna shoot the 24 millimeter, 35 millimeter, 50 millimeter, and 70 millimeter. And I'm gonna take that. And that way when we get them back to the office, we can compare the two images off the two lenses and just see how they look. I'm gonna try to keep everything composed exactly the same. I'm not gonna move the tripod. I'm not even gonna take the camera off the thing. So that's what we're gonna do. Okay, so I've shot my shots now on the 24 to 70 and the 24 to 200. We ran an ISO 100, aperture of f11. Most of my distance is out there, a little bit in the foreground to be aware of, so keep an eye on that. And then a shutter speed of 1/8. I kept those settings through the whole thing. As I zoomed in, I had less sky, so I probably could have changed my settings a bit, but just to try to keep everything consistent across it, I kept those settings through all 4 focal lengths on both lenses. What we'll do is we'll get these back in the office, throw them in Lightroom, we'll just do a couple tweaks, keep them the same across all the images, and then we'll pull up the high resolution files and start taking a look at those corners and taking a look at that sharpness and see what we see between the two lenses. So I do want to grab another composition while we're out here, just so we have a couple different images to look at, a couple different scenes. So I'm gonna hike along this trail a little bit, see what we can find, get one more composition in before some of this rain hits, and we'll go from there. Okay, so we're just gonna move on, find one more composition here. Pretty rainy day, so I'm sort of working between the rain, and we're just gonna walk down this path, see if we can find one more semi-interesting composition for this. And so that second composition didn't go quite as planned. As I was moving towards my location when I was scouting out, trying to find a spot to go, the skies opened up. It was a downpour. I had to hurriedly pack up my gear, get it put away. While I don't mind photographing bad weather, I mean, let's face it, as a landscape photographer, some of the best images come from that. For the purposes of this video, where I was comparing the 2470 to the 24-200 and sharpness, I just didn't feel like a rainy, wet situation like that was gonna be conducive to good tests. So we scratched it for that day, and we went back out there, and that's where we go to now as we go out and gather our second image for this comparison. So yeah, we got rained out yesterday. Actually, I tried to shoot that shot a couple different times. Finally, the rain just hit so hard, it just wasn't worth trying to compare the two, because just switching the lenses would have been a little difficult. So out here real quick this morning, looking for one more composition to test the sharpness between a 2470 f4 and a 24-200. We'll get that shot, and then we'll get them back on the computer and do a little bit of comparison and see how they look. Okay, so I found my scene, and I'm gonna shoot it like the one I did yesterday. We're gonna shoot 2470 f4, we're gonna shoot it at 24 millimeters, 35 millimeters, 50 millimeters, and 70 millimeters. What I've got here is I got this little pond, I got these trees out in the background, a little bit of texture in the sky, it's a little on the bright side, but we've got it there. I'm gonna get my camera settings set for this. I'm gonna leave the settings the same, take the shots on the 24 to f70, and then switch it over to the 24-200, shoot the same focal lengths, and then we'll get these images back home to compare on the computer. Okay, and that wraps up our second composition. We're out here at this little pond, the trees, shot the 2470 to f4, shot the 24 to 200, used 24, 35, 50, and 70. Those are the images we'll take home, put in Lightroom, and we'll compare. We'll take a look at the crispness, sharpness, get out there those edges and see what it looks like, and see what these lenses look like in a real world test compared to each other in actual outside conditions and not lab. So see you in the office. Okay, so we're back here in the office with the two compositions, and I just want to set the stage a little bit for how we're going to look at these. We're going to look at them in Lightroom, and we're going to look at them side by side. We're going to pull them up, and we're going to look at the edges of the images, and we're going to look at them from the 24 millimeter, 35 millimeter, 50 millimeter, and 70 millimeter. And we'll work through it sort of quick, just to get a feel for what each image sort of looks like at the edges. I did apply some basic lightweight editing to these images. That's a little bit of exposure, brought it up if it needed, fixed highlights, things like that, just very minimal in Lightroom. And I did that to the first image of the composition and then applied those settings to each of the other ones. So all of the images should be the same as far as editing, so any changes I did make have been applied to each. Those are what we'll be looking at in Lightroom, and with that, let's get to it. Okay, we've got our two images pulled up here in Lightroom. This is the 24mm version. These were shot at 1/8 shutter speed, f11, ISO 100. Let's just dump right in and look at the center of the image. Not expecting too many problems here. Got the 2470 on the left, 24-200 on the right, and these look fairly similar to me as far as in terms of sharpness and things like that, which I would expect at the center of the lens. So let's zoom back out. Let's go down to the corner of the image down here, lower right corner. Again, 2470 on the left side, 24-200 on the right. And let's just take a peek. Here's a similar spot. We got the leaf here. We got the stick that comes across. I think these are really close. I do not see a whole lot of difference. Maybe a touch towards the 2470 being a little bit sharper, but I'm afraid that could just be bias because I know which lens is on which side. Let's just take one more look at a different corner in this image just to see. We'll zoom back out. We'll bounce over here to this tree over here, upper left. Come in here, let's take a look at sharpness first. Now here, this spark seems like it might be just a little bit sharper than over here. I don't think it's a huge difference, but I do think I would give the edge a little bit to the 2470 here. Now, one thing I am noticing is there is a fair amount of chromatic aberration here against the backlit trees, you know, where the dark trees right against that bright, bright sky, significantly more so than the 2470. And that's somewhat concerning. These do have chromatic aberration on at the moment, so it should be getting removed. So this would probably take some more fine tuning in Photoshop or Lightroom to try to clean that up a little more. So I do say the 24-70 has an advantage on this side with the lack of chromatic aberration over here. That left image looks really nice and clean. In the right side, we're getting that coloring. So that's a little distracting, a little concerning. So let's just jump down here. We'll zoom back out. Let's go grab the 35mm, compare those two. Again, these are the 35mm, same camera settings as before, 1/2 shutter speed, aperture of f11, shot at ISO 100. Let's go ahead and let's dive up here into this upper right hand corner real quick just to see what we get up here. The one good thing is the aberration is cleaned right up. That does not seem to be a problem at the 35mm, and that's sort of what I was looking for first because that wasn't that great in the 24mm version. Again, we got the 2470 on the left, 24-200 on the right. As far as sharpness, it's super close. It's so hard to tell. Like I'm looking right through here, looking at the bark and seeing what I think. Maybe a bit of an edge to the 2470. So let's come down here, lower left corner. And this is the 35mm image. This end, here's the leaves. I'm looking at these leaves over here, lower left. I would say it is slightly sharper in the 24-70 than the 24-200. This one is, I would say, is actually noticeable, and it's less me thinking, oh, it's just because I know which lens is which. This does appear to be a little sharp. If we come in a little more to here, as you can see, as we move into the frame and away from those edges of the lens, to me, these two leaves are near identical in sharpness. Okay, so let's move over to the 50mm and compare those. Let's zip up here in the upper left corner. First, I thought we were seeing aberration, but it was really just some ugly moss on the trees themselves. 2470s on the left, 24-200 on the right. I don't see a whole lot pronounced here at 50mm up there on those edges. Zoom back out. Let's go check this lower right corner. Find something similar. Okay, there's the little piece of twig through there with a couple of 3 little yellow flowers starting to come out. Pretty close, maybe a teeny tiny slight edge towards the 24-70 in this. Again, not a huge difference. Again, we are zoomed in almost 200%, probably slightly sharper on the 24-70. Let's just jump in and take a look at the center of the image to make sure we're good there. And here, these look super sharp. In fact, I'd almost say, if we look at this section right through here, I'd almost give the 24-200 a touch of an advantage there. This seems just a slightly more pronounced. Let's zoom back out. Let's go pick our last set of images for this first composition. Again, this is 70mm. Let's jump in right here on this. Again, maybe a slight edge to the 24-70 at this far edge. Not significant though. Again, I almost feel like it's my head telling me, well, the 24-70 is on the left versus the right. Pretty good there. So let's zoom back out. Let's just check this log right here. It's a little more towards the center of the frame. Yeah, these both seem about identical. We can see these branches, this little branch coming across here. You can see it coming across here. Both seem pretty sharp. Again, at the center of this lens, either one seem pretty good. And we'll jump on to our next images. Okay, so let's dive in here into our second composition and let's take a look. It's going to be the same as the last set of images. We're going to look at the 24, 35, 50, and 70. But here we are. We'll start with the 24mm focal length. Again, same camera settings across the board, which was a shutter speed of 1/40th of a second, f11 ISO 100, and in this case I do have some items at the edges of the screens and in the clouds in the sky. So let's take a look at the shoreline right across the way, sort of center of the image. Look at this foliage up here. And I would say these trees are pretty crisp. I'd almost give edge to the 24-200, which is on the right side. Those look just a little crisper to me than they do on the left. Again, this is 24 millimeters, and I would almost give the edge again at the center towards the 24-200. Zoom out, take a look at this edge up here on the left side, right at the far left side. And I'm sort of looking like right through here. I find it difficult to tell the difference. Maybe a tiny slight edge to the 24-70, but not significant, and almost wonder if it's just biased because I know which lens is which. Pop out of there. And let's move on to my 35 millimeter image. So this is the 35 millimeter. It looks like I was just a touch off from the 24-70. So we're actually comparing 35.5 to 35. Let's take a look over here at the right side. I'm looking at these trees up in here, the flowering blossoms. Again, super close on this one. Yeah, I'm not sure I can tell the difference between those two. Those seem really close to me in terms of sharpness. Let's look down here in this pine to see what. In this case, I'm not really seeing a difference in the image as we get into that 35 millimeter range there at the edges. Bounce over to this side. We looked at that in the other image. Everything looks pretty crisp here at 35 millimeter. I'm going to say I don't see a whole lot here difference in these images. Possibly slightly better exposed than the images in the original composition. A little less shadow, and that might be why we're getting a much closer sharpness comparison. Zoom out of there. Let's bounce over to our 50 millimeter image. I missed it on the 24-200 this time, 51 millimeter to 50. Let's just zoom in right here on the center. Okay, so we're looking at this bush like right here, and this is the center of the image. I would say these are both the same, maybe a slight edge of the 24-200. Zoom out, take a look at the edge over here. Okay, we're on the far left side. I'm not seeing a huge difference in this. Yeah, barely perceptible difference in this. And let's just do one quick look at this lower left corner. This was super close. This is going to be almost a depth of field blurriness, but I would say they're both about the same. Again, this was pretty close to the camera. I'm shooting f11, but it might have been a little too in the foreground to be super crisp. I would say they're about the same. And let's take a quick look at the 70 millimeter images. Compare those. Zoomed in a little more. Go right hand side of the frame. Let's find something similar. Okay, so we got this tree coming down through the center. This tree coming down. Yeah, I'd say that looks pretty good. I'm not seeing a huge difference, noticeable difference between those. So let's zoom out. Let's bring it over to the right side of the frame. We got a couple rocks here. Look at those on either side. Yeah, I'm not seeing a huge difference. What I'm sort of looking at is there's this rock here, and there's two little lighter colored rocks right there that also exist over there. I'm not seeing a huge difference. Maybe a teeny tiny bit over here, but again, situation where I feel like this might be just me knowing that the 24-70 is on the left. So yeah, so I think that takes a look at our comparison between the images. So I hope you found that comparison useful. And I think after looking at those two images, those two compositions, at a 24 millimeter focal length, a little wider, there was some softness that you could see. Sometimes I think it was a little bit of bias because I knew which lens was which. But there were times where I think there was a little bit of softness at those extreme edges. In the center of the compositions, I think the sharpness was on par, near equal, sometimes even a touch of an advantage towards the 24-200, at least in that real world view. As you started to get into 35 millimeter, I think that softness got a little better. And by you're getting that 50 millimeter and 70 millimeter, I did not see it nearly as pronounced across the two. Now, probably the one concerning thing I did see with the 24-200 is when we were at that 24 millimeter and strong backlight against those trees, so we had the tree branches up there and the backlight coming through, there was significant chromatic aberration on that 24-200. To the point it was slightly concerning that if I was shooting something backlit at a 24 millimeter focal length, the 24-200 seemed a little weak compared to the 24-70. So that is something to keep in mind, chromatic aberration. We didn't really get to test out, sun flares and things like that. I've heard there's a little bit of more flaring in the 24-200 than the 24-70. Didn't really get a chance to test that out. Maybe in a future video, we'll take a look at the two lenses at like a sunrise or a sunset and see how that goes. So after comparing those two lenses, at the edges to see what their sharpness was like, yes, it wasn't quite as sharp in the 24-200, but only when I was pixel peeping. I don't see that as being a real world problem. Even if I printed something out, I don't see it being a huge problem or an issue with that. I don't see myself regretting taking a 24-200, capturing that amazing shot and going, oh, if only I'd done it with my 24-70. I think they're close enough that some of the advantage of the 24-200 brings is well worth continuing to use it. And that's for travel, easy portability, and if I'm out in some poor weather conditions where I don't want to do a lot of lens swaps and have a wide focal length range, the 24-200 is still a really strong lens. So I hope you found this video useful, and if you did, please hit that like button. And if you want to see future landscape photography content from me, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any behind the scenes looks at landscape photography, mini gear reviews, comparisons like this, and any other future landscape photography content from me. And thank you for watching.